and welcome to our podcast. We are so excited to have you along for our journey. My name is Madison, and I'm the director of Peace Restored. I will be your host as we discuss mental health and faith in our podcast, Seeking Healing, Finding Hope, which is a production of Peace Restored, a 501c3 nonprofit located in Indiana and serving women everywhere. Today on our podcast, I have back in the studio with me is Rebekah Gilmore, who is joining us. As you might remember, Rebekah is on staff with us, and she is currently a student at Liberty University pursuing her master's, and she works with us as a counseling intern. So we're excited to have her with us to help us continue the conversation on boundaries.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So, Rebekah, would you mind giving us a recap of what we talked about in our last podcast on boundaries?
Sure. So we dove in a little deeper and discussed boundary problems within a family dynamic with your family members. And we talked about the signs and what it looks like to have lack of boundaries within that system. We went through some examples with that as well. We talked also about why we have those problems, why we do those things, or why we don't set those boundaries. And then we discussed steps of resolution.
Yeah. So it was a really good conversation as we walked through those different parts in our family, because as we talked about, having those family relationships can be a little complicated at times, especially when we talk about our family of origin. And then as we become adults and we have our own families, whether that's a family just with a spouse or a family with children, those are all families. And sometimes even in between, when we're by ourselves, we're still an individual. We're an individual family. So we don't want to miss out. We don't want to forget the singles too, because sometimes I think we forget about talking about the singleness as being their own entity as well.
Yeah.
And so all of those types of dynamics in the family can be really complicated. So if you didn't get a chance to listen to that podcast, as we say, go back and listen to that, because even if you might be saying, well, I don't have problems with my family. Well, I'd still encourage you to go back and look, because we all have room to grow. And so there might be a way where you can improve your relationship with your families, and there might be things that you maybe never thought of before. Because I don't know about you, Rebekah, but before I read the Boundaries book the first time several years ago, there was lots I didn't know about boundaries. I don't even think I heard the term really boundaries.
Yeah, me neither.
It wasn't a term I grew up with.
Yeah,
I mean,
me neither.
I think it's more popularized today in our culture, the word boundaries.
I think it is becoming more popular.
Yeah, I think, but I don't. I'm a few years older than Rebekah, and so when I was younger, I don't even think it was a term that we ever talked about. So I think just the idea of boundaries has been growing culturally over time. While the book Boundaries has been around for a while, I think culturally we're all beginning to understand it. And so I think because of that, it's causing many people to wrestle with, what does it truly mean to have a healthy boundary?
Yeah, you might have issues within your family or in a relationship and not realize that it's a boundary problem specifically. You just know there's issues there.
Yeah. And
you don't know what that exactly is yet. And so
because sometimes we put a different name on it than what it truly is.
Yeah.
So go back and listen if you haven't heard it, or go back and listen to, now we've done 5 other podcasts on boundaries. So this is our 6th one. So if you haven't listened to those first 5, go back and hopefully learn some things. So today, though, we're going to be talking about boundaries and friends. And some people might be like, well, that's a little pushing, they might not like that, because sometimes our friends, we might consider our safe people.
Yeah.
And so we might not, it might be difficult to figure out how to have boundaries with them because they might be the ones we lean into. So when we start thinking about boundaries with friends, what are some things that you start to think about?
Just generally, I guess I think of when somebody will continually push the limits with you, convince you to do things you might not be comfortable with, causes you just to always push yourself in a direction that you might not intend to, and then it can cause some resentment or bitterness towards your friend. It can just kind of I forget the term. Is it salt the water or mucky the water?
Oh, to muck up the water? Yeah, 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 yeah.
I'm not sure the phrase there, but
That's
it came
okay.
to mind.
Yeah, but I think people get the idea, right? Sometimes it kind of just confuses everything a little bit. And so, so as we think about our friendships, it can be challenging to make sure we're setting those boundaries well, because sometimes they might ask or require things of us that are outside of what we're able to do. So there's some things that we want to think about when we think about the boundaries within the dynamic of our friendships. And part of that is is in the area of conflict. And so when we think about conflict, what's one of the first things that kind of come up for you when you think about conflict and boundaries with friends?
Well, I think of 4 specifically different conflicts.
Okay.
The first one I would think about is when there's 2 compliant people in the relationship, and just what issues come up there specifically for that dynamic. I think of 2 people kind of just being afraid of hurting the other person's feelings, and they both end up just not doing what they want to do because they're just keeping the peace. They're just trying to be people pleasers to each other, but then equally sort of starting to resent each other as well.
Yeah, so they're afraid to say what they think.
Yeah.
They're just like, oh, I'm just got to kind of ride the waters with them.
Yeah.
And so because both of them are the compliant personalities, they both just kind of just almost looks like they're a little avoidant.
Yeah.
But not necessarily. I guess they're not avoidant.
They're avoidant of being truthful about what they're wanting to do. They think it might hurt the other person's feelings.
Yeah.
And so they want to avoid that conflict.
Yes.
And so, but they're both doing it, so they're both not getting anywhere.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they don't really know the desires of their friend truly. And so there's that wall in between them, I kind of envision. They're not as close as they could be.
Yeah. So they're just doing all the things that they think that they should do to keep. I love that you use the word keep the peace.
Yeah.
Because there's a difference between peacekeepers and peacemakers. Have you heard that before?
Yeah.
Yeah. So a lot of times we talk about, like, we just got to keep the peace.
Yeah.
And a peacekeeper will do anything, like they will go to any length to keep the peace.
Yeah.
But when we think about peacemakers, sometimes to be a peacemaker, you have to do some things that are uncomfortable.
Yeah.
You have to kind of get in there and wrestle through some things.
Yeah.
And so, so sometimes that can be a challenge for people. Yeah, so when we think about the compliant relationship and friends, when we're speaking about boundaries, what are some of the symptoms that you might see in that?
I would say either one or both parties might have a feeling of dissatisfaction in the relationship. They might feel like they're doing things that they maybe shouldn't have done. And so they have that weighing on their shoulders a lot.
Yeah. So that can cause a lot of weightiness in the relationship, that dissatisfaction. Like, I did something that I didn't really want to do, or I didn't feel like I should have done, but I did it because I just wanted to be compliant.
Yeah.
Like I felt like
just please the other person.
Yeah.
I feel like they enjoyed it maybe.
Yeah.
Making excuses for themselves, pretty much not being truthful to their friend.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm thinking of a friend who you call and you say, hey, you want to go do something? And they immediately will drop everything because they want to make you happy.
Yeah.
They're so worried about affecting that relationship that they're willing to change their total schedule just to go do whatever you ask, even if it's inconvenient for them.
Yeah. Harmful to them.
Yeah. But then later they might be like, ugh, I'm glad I went out, but I'm feeling dissatisfied and feeling uncomfortable because I really wanted to spend that time doing
something else.
Yeah, something else. I was in the middle of baking a cake, but they called me and I left my cake, and now my cake's ruined.
Now I don't have my cake for the event I needed it for later.
Right.
Yeah.
And what I started is now ruined, and so I have to throw it away and start over again. So now I'm dissatisfied. I'm frustrated.
Yeah.
Yes, that can be challenging. So when we think about that, where does kind of the root of that begin?
So definitely thinking back to the way that they grew up, and both people growing up in a family system where they were taught to avoid saying no to others, just for the sake of keeping everybody happy. And when both people have similar roots like that, they're both battling that same wrongful taught behavior.
Yeah, exactly. And as we're talking about this, it's reminding what we talked about in the last podcast was that attachment theory, right? And so this goes right back to is how did we relate? How did we attach? How did we grow up? And so depending on what that dynamic was in our early years is going to depend on how we relate as adults in all relationships. And so it's what I hear coming out in this is it goes back to our roots. Our roots go back, to the root of our beginning, right? So our backgrounds, where did we come from? How did we learn? How did we develop? All those things affect that. I think I'm thinking about how sometimes when somebody's in that compliant relationship, they kind of politely will be like, oh, really, it's not that big of a deal. It's fine. Go back to our example of the cake, right? Like
it's okay.
The friend calls up and says, hey, you want to go do something? And she's like, yeah, it's fine. I was just going to bake cake, but it's fine. It's fine. It's just fine. I can do it later. It's not a big deal. I want to go out with you.
Yeah. Making extra excuses to make the other person feel happy or important.
Yeah. But instead it's really internally causing some usually internal conflict. Maybe not right away, but over time, it's like it builds up these layers and layers and layers.
Yeah,
because you imagine, we go back to that example, that friend again, that friend that's calling and the other friend jumps and they go do their thing. And maybe at first the friend's like, oh, it's not that big of a deal. I'm going to go.
Yeah.
But then maybe that happens 5, 6, 7, 12 times.
Yeah.
And then after the 12th time, they're like, man, it's so frustrating. They keep calling me and like they call me at the most inconvenient times. Like,
another example I think of too for compliant, like one friend asks the other friend if they want to go see this concert or go to this concert on a certain date, and then the other friend, and they ask that friend because they think that's a concert they'll really enjoy. And then the other friend just complies and is like, sure, but doesn't really want to go. And they end up going, and then they later find out that neither one of them really even wanted to go.
Yeah. Like we're all just trying to make each other happy here, right?
Yeah. It's like neither one of them are doing what they're wanting to do. They're just trying to make the other one happy.
Yeah. Because I think that's a lot of times what happens in that compliant relationship. Because I think regardless if you're going out to dinner with somebody or whatever, like they're just trying to find the way to connect.
Yeah.
And that connection, they're both just willing, like whatever they say, even if they're just offering something that's not really what they want to do, but they're doing it because they think the other person wants it.
Yeah.
And so sometimes what we need to learn in that dynamic is how just to be honest. And that if you've never practiced that and you're in that dynamic where everything, you just feel the compulsion to be compliant, maybe it's learning to say, I really want to go out with you to go do something, but right now is not the right time, or I really do want to go to a concert with you, but I don't want to do that one. I really hate that band.
Maybe we try a different band.
Like I value you, right? Because I think sometimes we think when we say no, we say we don't value them.
Yeah. Or if you even say, I don't really have an interest in going to a concert, they might feel like it's saying that they don't like the other person just because it's something that they like.
Yeah.
And it's okay to not like the same things.
Yeah, absolutely. So then that takes us to the second type of conflict, which is the compliant aggressive controller. So that sounds heavy. So can you explain for those listening what it means to be a compliant aggressive controller? It's a lot of words.
It is. Yeah. So this is when the compliant feels intimidated and inferior in the relationship. The aggressive controller side then feels irritated at being pestered by the compliant.
Mm-hmm. So they have that intimidation. The compliant person's like, I'm just going to do what I need to do to keep, again, going back to, I have to keep the peace.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of think that this person might feel like they're walking on eggshells.
Yeah. And then somehow always pestering
Mm-hmm.
the other person or making the other half
Yeah.
of the relationship feeling pestered all the time or annoyed by them.
Yeah. Yeah. So it can be challenging. So then the other person is that aggressive controller, right? They want to they keep pushing at the other person to get them to be compliant. And sometimes it's not a nice pushing. Sometimes they can get, like, as the word says, aggressive.
Yeah.
And so it really affects the relationship. So when we think about the compliant is usually the one that's unhappy in that relationship, right? Because they're not getting what they need. They're just doing whatever they have to keep the other one happy.
Mm-hmm.
So what are some symptoms that we think about in this compliant, aggressive controller dynamic?
Yeah, so the compliant will feel very controlled and resentful.
Mm-hmm.
And then the symptom of the other side, the aggressive controller, they feel good, except they don't like being pestered. And so...
Yeah. So the aggressive controller, they're like, hey, I'm getting what I need, but...
Yeah, there's no problem here except them pestering me.
Yeah. They would just do what I want when I want it, and we'd all be good. But then the other person, they're like, man, it's
not fulfilling.
It's not fulfilling. They're, the controlled, as you said, that's, that feeling of control. Nobody wants to feel controlled, but when you feel that on a daily or in an ongoing part of your relationship, it can bring in that resentment. And sometimes with resentment, it brings anger.
Yeah.
And so we can see how that can affect boundaries. It's really hard to have healthy and safe boundaries in that area. And so, again, we go back to, we always want to think about, where did this come from, right? So a lot of times those compliant individuals grew up being taught to avoid the conflict, right? Right. So they avoid the conflict rather than really kind of push into it or press into it. And that can be a challenge to flip that script. Like, how can I learn to be okay with conflict? That can be a challenge. But then on the other hand, that aggressive controller was never taught how to not get what they want all the time. Or another way to say that is to delay gratification, right? Mm-hmm. So they haven't learned how to wait or even take responsibility for themselves, because it's like, give me what I want when I want it now.
And that's what they usually have always gotten.
Yeah. And so because that's it's kind of been that learned behavior over time. If I do this behavior, I'll get what I want.
Yeah.
And then when they get into that new relationship, the compliant person just follows suit.
Yeah.
And then it teaches by behavior the aggressor that is what you have to do to keep getting what you want.
That makes me think of oiling the squeaky wheel, right?
Mm-hmm.
To get it to stop squeaking.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Because the more you keep doing that behavior, the more it's going to keep. Yeah. When we think about those roots and how it really kind of takes effect early on, it really does affect that relationship from that compliant aggressor standpoint. And so we think about how that affects our boundaries. So what happens with that boundary conflict with the two?
Yeah. So in a relationship like that, there's the inability of the compliant to set those clear limits. Mm-hmm. They're afraid of setting that boundary. And then the aggressive controller has the inability to respect the compliance limits.
Okay. Yeah, so it's really hard to know how to respect and manage a boundary when you're in that relationship.
Yeah.
So when we think about boundaries in this compliant aggressor dynamic, often the compliant needs to see that they are not a victim of the aggressive controller, and that they're kind of relinquishing or volunteering or giving up their power to their friend, which can be a really hard statement to swallow.
Yeah.
Now, that's not saying that if you are in a relationship, because even if this is a friend-friend dynamic, a boyfriend-girlfriend dynamic, whatever relationship, we are not saying that if someone is physically harming you or emotionally, if they're being abusive, we're not saying like, it's all your fault. That's not what we're trying to say. I don't want someone that's listening to this podcast hear us saying that if you're in an abusive dynamic, it's your fault. No, it's not. 100% not. That person that is abusing you has full responsibility for themselves. Yeah. What we're saying is that if you have power to stop what you allow in your presence. Yeah. And when you've spent a lot of time in relationships where you have been the compliant person, and especially if you've been in a relationship with that more aggressive person, it can feel as if there's never any other option but to comply. And so for that person that's listening and just saying, I don't think they understand, this is not possible, I'm feeling judged right now, I'm feeling like I'm not heard, I just want to pause and say that we do hear you, we do see you, it is our heart to be present with you in this. Yeah. That to know that if you are in that dynamic or relationship where you feel like you're pushed against a wall, where you're walking on those eggshells and you need help learning how to say no, how to set boundaries, if it feels unsafe at all, we are not suggesting that you need to figure this out on your own. This is when we'd say, please stop, reach out for help, find someone that can help you process through this, because it can be very scary. Yeah. Because sometimes we think about abuse just in a marital or a couple relationship, a romantic relationship. Thank you. And that's not always the case. Abuse can come in all types of relationships. And so if that is, again, your story, know that we recognize that is a hard place to be in. Yeah. But we do want to give you tools on how to get out of that if you're ready. And so we just encourage you just to reach out. If you want to go to our website, which is peacerestore.net, you can do that. And just click through. If you're not ready to talk to somebody, that's fine. You can just go through our website. We have all kinds of resources on there for you to read, to look at. We have videos on our YouTube channel. You can go there too. Just make sure you're getting something to help you help you decide how to make some different choices. And that's kind of what we're talking about here, is that when you're in that relationship, as if you are the compliant person and there's an aggressor, you can make some choices to help you get out of that dynamic to where you're not having to be in that relationship and experience that aggressive behavior for a long term. Yeah. There's a way out. Mm-hmm. The aggressive controller needs to be able to own that that they have difficulty listening to no's and accepting other people's limits. And that can be challenging for somebody who is a controller, right? Because being able to stop and listen is not their norm.
Yeah, they've never been taught.
Yeah.
To wait and take responsibility for themselves. So,
so that can be really hard for somebody who's had not been challenged to stop and listen and be still, because their response has been, if I say, the other person does it, right?
Yeah. If I act out this way, they're going to do what I want.
Which doesn't lend to let's stop and think and process through what's happening. It's, I just could become, if they don't listen, I become more aggressive. Yeah.
I think in this scenario, though, it is important for the compliant party to realize, like, they're the ones that need to take the first step, whether big or small. Because without that, the aggressive controller won't even realize they need to even think about what they're doing.
Yeah.
And they don't have any consequences yet. And so if the compliant was able to change their behavior, it would be a wake-up call, I guess, to the aggressive controller, or at least a starting point for them to start self-reflecting.
Yeah. That would be the goal, right? Is that if that compliant person could take the first step and just say, hey, I'm not going to allow this anymore. And you may need to put, if you are that compliant person here in this relationship that we're describing, you might need to find some safe people to put around you to help put up some protocols to, like, if this accelerates,
definitely,
what can I do to keep myself safe? So we're not, again, saying just jump in and make these changes. Do them safely. But maybe you're listening, and as you're listening to this, maybe something's hitting your heart and going, man, I am the aggressive controller. And that could be a really heavy, almost might feel like a brick hit. I'm like, like that's me. And if you're listening to this and that's who you are, thank you for listening. Thank you for trying to find out what can I do different to improve my relationship. But how would you encourage that a person who's listening that's an aggressive controller? What would be some action steps that they might need to take?
Definitely to reach out for some support with other people, to be able to dig in deeper just to their own roots and why they maybe haven't learned those necessary delaying gratification tactics and taking responsibility. Find somebody that can help walk through those steps with them.
It's almost like having an accountability partner is what I'm hearing.
Yeah.
Because they're having to relearn how to behave.
Yeah.
And sometimes when we're used to having that controlling tendency, having someone who can be there to say, I'm going to walk with you. I'm going to help hold you accountable. Yeah. So if you respond negatively, you have someone to call, someone to talk through this with you.
Yeah.
That can be really powerful.
Yeah, I'm sure it's tempting in knowing, like, if you act a certain way, you'll get this out of it.
Yes.
But just having that realization is just the first step to change your behavior is different.
For sure. Yeah. So, and I almost think, I'm thinking about both sides now as the compliant and the controlling aggressive person. They both could use that accountability person, because even if you are being compliant, that can feel almost like the nicer of the two options, if you will.
Yeah.
But you need someone to hold you accountable too, to say, how can I help you? Not always say yes. How can I help you to say no when you need to say no? How can I help you to set the boundaries? Were you able to hold the boundary this week? And then for the aggressive person, they need to have that person to ask them, well, did you accept the boundaries this week?
Yeah. Makes me think of too, earlier in the boundary series, I think we discussed it in an earlier podcast, just about being passive, and for the compliant side, being passive isn't going to change anything, right? It's going to keep you in the same place. You have to put action with it.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we have to make sure that we are putting action with all of our steps, because just listening isn't going to change it. I mean, listening is huge. Listening is one of the first steps we want to do, but we want to make sure that we are taking those next steps.
Yeah.
So this has, again, been another good conversation on boundaries. I appreciate us being able to dive in a little bit deeper and just continue to go a little bit deeper each time as we get together and just talk about a little bit more of those relationships. Again, if you have not heard all of our podcasts, I can encourage you to go back and listen to the other podcasts. You can go to any podcatcher that you so choose. It can be through Apple, through Spotify. If you don't know how to find a podcatcher, you can also catch us on YouTube and listen to it on our YouTube channel. It's just Peace Restored. Search for that on YouTube, and you should be able to find us through that as well. And then you can also find this on our website at peacerestored.net. So in the meantime, like I said, if you'd like to learn more about us, you can go to our website. If you are wanting to talk to one of our staff, though, you can also give us a call here at our office. Our phone number here is 317-361-5281. Feel free to reach out to our staff and just chat with them. We're happy to provide resources to you, to talk to you, to give you more information, Or if you're ready to set up a counseling appointment with one of our staff, you can do that as well through either our website or reaching us online or through our phone number. If you'd like to learn more about anything that we've discussed in our podcast today, make sure to check out our show notes where we'll have additional links and contents and maybe some videos as well. I hope you'll continue to come back and listen to us on our podcast as we'll continue to share more about mental health and faith. As we wrap up today, I hope you, again, will just stay tuned with us as we continue to share with you practical ways where you too can seek healing and find hope. Join us on our next podcast where we'll continue to discuss mental health and faith. Come back next time for more transformation, growth, and power. This is Peace Restored.